I found this image from the New York Times, a story where reindeer are a way of life. And this is about the area where two of our anthropologists were studying, Tim Ingold and Robert Payne. And in fact, this chapter derives from an argument that Payne and Ingold were having over 50 years ago. Well, that's when Payne went on his field work. So they were having an argument about reindeer and people. There is one similarity between Ingold and Payne. They both get obsessed by. Yeah, so as an anthropologist, you usually go to study people. But in this case, the people were very obsessed with the reindeer. And so then the anthropologist just starts filling up their field notes with, where are the reindeer going today? What are we going to do? Are they going to be over there? And this happens not just among the Sami, it happens in lots of different places among cattle herders and different kinds of anthropologists where it seems that the people are more interested in some of the animals they keep than they are even in other people. So they both had reindeer on the brain, as Payne and Ingold said. Now, one of the things I like about this particular chapter as a starting point is one, it gives us a very good animal examples or very specific field work and anthropologists doing field work examples. But it also, although you may not realize it, recapitulates what I would say is almost the entire history of anthropological thought. Which, oddly enough, that's what we're in this class for officially, is to get the whole history of anthropological thought. And every so often, we'll just do it in one class. We can probably do it in 15 minutes. So it has to do with the idea of culture. Now, in the olden days, before anthropology, in the 19th century, there was this idea that only certain humans had culture. The humans at the top of the social scale. Not only just they were maybe Westerners or civilized Europeans, but even within their category of themselves, they would say that they're the top, the cream of the crop, the best of the best. The people who went to art museums, sipped champagne and chugged beer. Those are the people who had culture. What was the big innovation of anthropology? The biggest thing anthropology ever did. Yeah, you take this word, which was once, nobody even knew this word. It was actually, even the word itself was pretty limited in its application. And you take something that only the elitist of the elite had, and anthropology says, no, wait a second. Culture or learned behavior is what all humans have. In fact, culture is what makes us human, our ability to learn different ways of life and to grow up in a society is actually what is peculiarly human about us. And that learned behavior or culture is the reason why people are different from each other. That's the basis of human difference, is their learning behavior. Now, this was super important in the United States, probably around the world, but I would say in some ways most important in how anthropology developed in the United States. Why was it so important to assert that what makes humans different from each other is their culture, learned behavior? Why would that be particularly important in the 19th century? Native Americans. I would say yes, in a big sense, in the sense that in what sort of category had the Native Americans been placed into by the year 1925, for example? Yes. Yeah, they'd been placed in the inferior, just basically completely displaced from their land and not and assumed to not have any value except in the sense of, say, nostalgia or going off and pretending you're a Native American. People are always into that, but not in the sense of actually contributing to the developing American society. People wanted to wipe them off the map. So why is it important, though, that we're asserting that learned behavior is why people are different from each other, and that it may be valuable because actually, yes, it is true that most US anthropologists cut their teeth on studying indigenous American societies and trying to communicate back to the rest of the Americans that these societies might have something of value and might be respected as such, and we're not as inferior. Let me put it to you this way. What did people think explained why people were different from each other in the 19th century or 100 years ago? Yes, race. Exactly. Right. And so by asserting that learned behavior or culture is why we are different, anthropology is saying that culture is a bigger deal than biological race and the supposed inferiority or superiority, which in the case of the Native Americans was placed upon their biology. They're not smart enough or whatever to be, or too nice to the earth to be part of our society. Or especially, I would say, in terms of how enslavement in the Americas developed, in terms of Africans who were then relegated to the underclass category as well. And so anthropology was trying to assert that, in fact, this explanation of human behavior or human difference by race didn't work. I would say they were also trying to fight against the environmental determinism that everybody up in the Arctic, for example, was going to be limited by their natural environment. And so they were again trying to argue for the importance of learned behavior, and that's why people were different from each other. So Ingold goes off to study the Sami, and he comes back and he writes an article that in some ways says that the reindeer are also in their own society and they are learning things too and teaching each other things, I think they put it. What was Robert Paine's objection to this? Why did he get so pissed off that Ingold was describing the reindeer as if they too were walking around and learning things and transmitting their learning from one to the other? And what was wrong with that? Yeah, right. What the hell, Ingold? You're anthropomorphizing. You've gone nuts, man. Because the basic objection is reindeer don't have culture. Are you crazy? No, humans have culture. That's what makes us different from the animals is our learned behavior and culture. We all have it. We don't want to get into these hierarchies of human beings, but we all have it. And the reindeer don't have it. Come on, Ingold. Stop talking nuts. What did he say? That he'd gone crazy. Where is the evidence, Paine fumed, for supposing that the animals have anything at all approaching a reciprocal body of knowledge deduced from experience about the herdsman, right? The idea that the reindeer might be learning about the herdsmen in the same way that the herders, in the same way the herders learn about the reindeer. So this was now to go back a little bit. One of the things that happened in anthropology is that as anthropologists started to promote this idea of culture, people got really into it and started to map out all these little different cultures. And so in some ways, culture went less of a thing, less of a process of becoming human and more of a noun that was said to typify different people. So the general message of anthropology that culture, learned behavior is more important than biological race held, but the thing was that culture itself became something that was, as anthropologists tried to describe what it became basically equivalent to traditions that were handed down from generation to generation in the form of rules or recipes for behavior. And in some ways, at least in the way things were appropriated in the US context and in other places, instead of believing that people were biologically determined by their race, you just substituted in cultural terms instead of racial terms. So instead of believing that, instead of believing that Mexicans were hard workers because of their biology, you would say that their culture is hardworking Mexicans, and that's what makes them the way they are. And so people became almost as trapped by their culture, or in these descriptions, as if it were race. They just swapped all the terms around and the same ideas have held. So the issue, though, is what actually is within anthropology. The issue was what actually is this culture? And the debate between Paine and Ingold was about who can communicate, who can communicate and what Paine called codify their knowledge. So Paine was saying that the Sami codify their knowledge, not like the reindeer. What was different about the reindeer and the humans is that humans were talking, maybe in some cases writing things down. They had a system or an explanation. But as Ingold notes, the idea that culture comes to us as a bunch of rules and recipes that we can transmit as rules and recipes is more of an artifact of the anthropologist who is recording all these things and then putting it into a book that talks about how these people behave. So if you actually go and talk to people, it is very rare that someone can explain the reasons or the underlying principles of the things they're doing. They're just doing it. They're just living. They're like any of us. I don't know why we're doing things. We're just living our lives. And so it takes an anthropologist stepping in from the outside to say, oh no, this is part of a tradition. And here they have these rules and regulations and recipes for their behavior. But that's more of an abstraction from what the people are actually doing. So Ingold's challenge to Paine, he said, well, wait a second. If the Sami can know without having to codify what they know, then is this knowledge so very different from that of the animals they herd? And it might be useful to think about how we actually learn how to do things, not school knowledge. Think about how you learned how to do things. How about riding a bike? Let's talk about riding a bike. How did you learn to ride a bike? How many of you read a book about riding a bike before you rode your bike? How many of your parents explained to you in detail how to ride a bike before you got on the bike? There are some rules of thumb, some general ideas, but most of the time you learn how to ride a bike. How? You ride the bike, right? In fact, the way I was taught how to ride a bike, my dad got a bike from a junkyard, fixed it up to make it rideable, and then got at the top of the hill, let me go. I fall down, still excited, come back up, get back on the bike, let me go again. Eventually, you learn how to ride the bike.
I think that was just you.
My mom was worried that Child Protective Services were going to be called in because I had so many bruises from that. But most people learn by doing it, right? Or with some instruction. You had training wheels. Did that work? I'm anti-training wheels because this is what happened to me anyway, is that Gave my kid the training wheels, and they were like, "Woo, I'm riding a bike, I'm riding a bike," and they were great at riding the bike with training wheels. And then I raised them up just a little bit. Boom, they fell over immediately. It didn't do anything. It gave them too much confidence, and then they just fell over and they were bruised. Actually, does anybody know? This is parenting advice for you. Does anybody, or even friendship advice if somebody doesn't know how to ride a bike? The best way to learn how to ride a bike. It's not the ways I've been talking about. It's actually not training wheels and it's not top of the hill. No, actually, the best way, you can watch this on YouTube. The best way is to take the pedals off. You take the pedals off, you learn the balance first, pushing yourself along, and they learn the balance. This worked great, by the way. A little scrape. The Germans actually have these bikes where they're called balance bikes that don't have pedals at all. When you take the pedals off, it can leave your legs all scraped up. This happened to my children, but it does work. And then you put the pedals back on once they have their balance, and then they go off. I can explain to you what to do, but until you actually do it, I haven't taught any of you to ride a bike yet. Just by saying that and knowing it, it still isn't the same thing as riding a bike. It isn't codified. Or a lot of things we do are not codified knowledge. And in fact, when you look back at Paine's field notes, what does he say about these reindeer? This is really funny. There's so many things in this chapter that are actually hilarious, but you have to know the joke. So here's Ingold. He goes off and studies with the reindeer, the Sami and the reindeer. And he comes back and he writes an academic article, one of his first, that is talking about the reindeer as if they have culture. And Paine, who studied with these people, writes into the journal, is like, this guy's gone mad. He's talking about reindeer can't have culture. That's crazy. But the funny thing was that Paine had studied there, but he hadn't written his big book yet. His book was going to come out 20 years later. It says, strangely enough, the evidence was there in Paine's own field journals, although another 2 decades were to pass before it came to light in the publication of his Herds of the Tundra. So basically, Paine was all pissed off at Ingold, but then 20 years later, he published his field notes in his field journals, and he says he had, as Mickey put it, this process of reciprocal learning between reindeer and their herders in which each learns the other's ways. Whoa, that's crazy. The reindeer. There's a quote. Animals learn about their herders' order of things, he writes, as well as herders about their animals. Reindeer, for example, familiarize themselves with the sounds and smells of the human camp and learn to associate these with security. And then, this is crazy. I have to keep going. Not all animals are equally involved in this learning process. Those most closely involved, and they might on this account be considered tame, go on to teach other animals in the herd, serving as intermediaries in the passage of knowledge across the species boundary. Crazy. Not only are the reindeer learning, there's like reindeer professors who are going in and learning about the humans and then going back and teaching the others. Maybe professors is too much. Maybe just ambassadors, reindeer. Reindeer professor. No, more like cultural brokers, you might say, between the reindeer and the humans. And then they pass them from one generation to the next, blah, blah. It is hard to get animals, especially older individuals, to unlearn what they already know. That's from Paine again. The same might be said, of course, of human beings. Yeah, that's for sure. So the thing is this leads to a theoretical conundrum in anthropology, which has lasted many years, and I don't know if we've ever solved this conundrum. Is how do you get to this big, we obviously know that people are guided by their culture and by learned behavior, but how do you get to the structures of culture without it being ever written down? How do you know how to ride a bike and do all the things that your culture requires without it necessarily being recorded or codified or tradition passed in this way? Wait a second, before we do that, the deer at Pine Lake and the deer on campus. Yeah, the deer around here look like they might hunt me down half the time. Like I'm walking along and they're looking at me like, get off my lawn. You see them walking up the street, up my sidewalk. They're just walking around like they own the place. Oneontans have deer on their brain. If you live in Oneonta, you're obsessed with deer almost as much as the reindeer because they're always, they eat up everything, they eat the trees, they'll eat everything. Yeah, well, there's too many of them. No, they were not here first. They depend on human beings. They're like overgrown mice.
Wasn't like the deer population exploding because we hunted all the wolves that were here?
Wolves in various environments are a kind of apex predator, which keeps the whole ecosystem in balance. And if you get rid of the wolves, it does that is one part of it. The other part of it is all the little grass and little suburban little plantings that we want to have, which are good environment for deer, but you can't have wolves in the suburbs. So the deer here have learned something different than the deer just a few miles away in Pine Lake. They're scared because they know about us. But here they'll learn. All right, so how do we get to culture without codification? That is a huge problem in anthropology, and many ideas have been proposed. An old idea that has come and gone in anthropology, but you're right to get excited about it. Transactionalism. I know, transactionalism. Now, I don't know, maybe we should still get excited about it. Transactionalism in anthropology, at least, was brought to us by somebody who was a fairly famous anthropologist. This is not the book where we get, this is by Friedrich Barth. This is not his transactionalism book, but he was a really interesting thinker over there in Norway. He wrote a lot of interesting things. If you see him in anthropology, you'll probably see his ideas about ethnicity and, as he said, ethnic groups and boundaries. He was one of the people who pioneered the idea that ethnicity is not so much based on the differences between, like measurable differences, but the fact that people differentiate themselves from each other along borders. So often people, it's like if you go to Greece and to Turkey, their forms of coffee drinking are almost identical. But if you cross the border, even though it's the same coffee, they'll insist that no, this is Turkish coffee and that Greek coffee is crap, and the other way around, even though it's the same. And there's all sorts of examples of this where you cross some border or people are trying to differentiate themselves from each other, and all of a sudden they might be doing almost exact the same thing. That's like, no, 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 this is totally different. This is those people over there, they don't know what they're doing. So the whole idea that ethnicity is socially constructed has a lot to do with Barth's work on the boundaries and the shifting boundaries of these ethnic groups and how we ourselves emphasize, or as human beings, we often play up differences, or conversely, if we want to unite with other people, we're like, hey, yeah, you're all the same as me. We're good here. Let's go fight somebody else. So, but yes, transactionalism was an idea that Barth pioneered. Let's read a little bit about this. The idea of transactionalism is that people are negotiating and living and acting within their self-interest. And as they go along, that ends up building up these larger structures that help everybody, even though everybody's trying to act in their own self-interest. Let me just read. It was an approach, this is on page 292, founded on the idea that social forms are not framed in the advance of the life that flows through them, but are themselves continually generated in the very course of social life through the accumulation of countless exchanges or transactions among individual actors, each pursuing which seems to be his or her best interests in the light of goals, values, and commitments in place of the time. So this is an idea that Friedrich Barth was pioneering, that is to say that people, instead of thinking of people as these automatons, as the receivers of tradition which they are blindly following, that they are actually actively engaged in negotiating their life. And we're all following and trying to follow our self-interest, but we have to do it in the company of other people, and that results in a social interaction. Transactionalism. And people were really excited about this. So Paine got excited about it, and he studied with Barth, and even Ingold himself went to study with Barth. He said, before embarking on my fieldwork, I spent a few months in Barth's department at the University of Bergen, Norway, in order to soak up the heady atmosphere he had created there. So Barth was a very charismatic figure, and he created this heady atmosphere. We're going to solve all the world's problems based on transactionalism. Now, what happened to Ingold? Oh, wait a second. Before I say that, yeah, well, let's just read. 16 months later, however, I returned from the field only to discover that the paradigm in which I had placed so much faith was on the verge of collapse. So basically, he goes in, gets all heady and involved, goes into the field, studies the reindeer, comes back, and everybody's like, dude, we don't do transactionalism anymore. It's over. I bring that up to say that anthropology is always full of isms that come and go, and nobody can understand what they meant. And then the next thing you know, they're gone. They rise, they fall. And as Ingold says, he went to the field with one idea, comes back, and everybody's like, nah, that's bullshit, man. We're on to something else. So, in part, I would say this has been a fault of anthropology, and why I sometimes get annoyed with the history of anthropological thought classes, because it's just a succession of isms and isms and isms. And I don't think Ingold is actually a part of that, of the succession of isms, although who knows, maybe he is. But what I think the transactionalism, I think the reason that it became critiqued in anthropology, and Ingold doesn't tell you about this, and Barth's ideas became critiqued. Well, let me put it to you this way. What does it sound like when we characterize human society as everybody's working in their self-interest, but it's all going to work out for the best because of the market? Does that sound like anything you've ever heard before? Capitalism. Yeah, that's an Adam Smith invisible hand idea, right? Everybody works in their self-interest. And if I do my thing and I'm trying to make money and you're trying to make money, but as long as we're honest with each other, it all works out in the market, and a wonderful society is created or enhanced. And so one of the critiques of transactionalism, which again, Ingold doesn't go into, is because in some ways it was a mirror image of neoliberal ideology, which is this idea that market behavior, individual market behavior, should govern social life. And so it didn't seem to answer the questions that anthropology had. And so what Ingold himself, though, was arguing that in fact, he says his original article was a parody or making fun of the idea of transactionalism, because in fact, humans don't act that way either. Sometimes we do. Obviously, sometimes we try to be strategizing and manipulating and acting only in our self-interest. But a lot of times we have a number of other goals and objectives around, and things to take care of, and family, and trying to teach somebody how to ride a bike and all these things. And it just does, we're not always motivated by strategizing and hierarchy and all the things they were. And so Ingold was saying that transactionalism didn't apply to humans or reindeer, that both were just trying to live their lives. Now, so we have this ascent of the idea of culture, but then trying to figure out how to explain how culture got there is still, I would say, it's still a bit of a puzzle in anthropology even today. But while transactionalism was falling down in anthropology, there were other places who were like, yeah, that sounds cool. I want some of that transactionalism. We think that this is the way that the creatures work. And now we turn to the baboons and what was called the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. Now, this is weird. The Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. Has everybody read The Prince? No? Yeah. It's a nice little book. There's various ideas about it. Machiavelli, in some ways, is seen as the founder of political science, you might say, the founder of dirty tricks to get ahead in politics. And what do you think of if I say somebody is Machiavellian? Is being able to manipulate people in terms of being clever and being tricky.
If you're referring to like actual history, then yeah, I
That's
agree.
annoying.
Yeah.
I'd rather be feared.
Yeah, yeah, right. If you're truly Machiavellian, you have risen to the top, but you would never say that. You'd be smart. Right. Yeah. You never self-identify as a Machiavellian. That would be that would ruin it. In fact, so what the idea was is why did primates develop such big brains? Primates in general, and humans in particular. And as Ingold said, a lot of people want to do the big brains. They want to say it's because of getting food and trying to get food. We had to make tools and then that would result in larger brains. But as Ingold says, the problem is that for most primates in their original environment, food's everywhere. There's no problem getting food. It's not a problem at all. So why do you need a big brain? Why do you have to have a big brain if it does not really necessary to survive? There's no reason for it. And what these researchers said is that in this section, Machiavelli among the baboons, is that in baboon society, it was like all these hierarchies and everybody's always trying to manipulate themselves and get to the top. And it's the social relationships and trying to manage all these social relationships, which leads to higher intelligence. And now it's a weird idea. Ingold goes on and on about how weird it is. He says that the Machiavellian psychologists of the Machiavellian persuasion, got to find these psychologists, would say that the animals are smarter than human beings. At least until Machiavelli emerged upon the stage to tell them how to better raise their game. So the idea is here comes Machiavelli to tell us humans how to be tricky like the baboons. But until we had Machiavelli, which is like, this guy is really old. That's like 500 years ago in Italy. But until there was Machiavelli, humans were dumber than baboons. It's a weird idea, right? To bring Machiavelli back into the baboons. I thought we might just look at some baboons here.
They're predicting where the baboons are gonna go.
I am super skeptical about this. Yeah, I don't think they're going to learn anything. I think it's even worse. I like the Machiavellian hypothesis better than I like this stuff. But anyway, go ahead. So Dr. Strum herself, I think, has said that she prefers boots on the ground. But these guys are convinced that if we float up in drones and we're up here, we're going to look at the baboons and we're going to be able to predict where they go. But the problem is, why? Like, why? I mean, what's the point?
They have the drone footage to watch where they go.
I am not a primatologist, obviously. But I do wonder about this drone stuff. It's like it took a lot of people and a lot of effort and a lot of computing power to do. It's like, I think it's going to go left. They're going to go right. Like, what are they going to get from this? The thing is, Elon Musk and Trump are shutting this whole stuff down. So we're not going to have to worry about this. Yeah, this is one of those things that's not going to be happening anymore. Not to worry. Okay. There we go. I looked around. I couldn't find anything from her. All right. So the idea is that these baboons are super smart social, or they need to be smart or have big brains because of their social activity. And while they were talking about the Machiavellian baboons, Ingold brings in to this conference that they had on the Machiavellian baboon hypothesis a little-known philosopher by the name of Bruno Latour, 1978. Now, At this point, you're all supposed to chuckle and laugh. No?
Because he's
He did become an intellectual giant. And so it's funny that Ingold is talking about it. 1978. Here comes Bruno Latour. He'd just gotten his degree in philosophy, and obviously he's French. And the French are able to flit around. So look at that. Bruno Latour was a French philosopher, anthropologist, and sociologist. He got to be all three. The French are famously able to just call themselves whatever they want to be, and they flit around and be big on the scene. So in comparison, we'll see Latour again in Ingold every so often, because Latour is like Ingold's nemesis, frenemy. I'm not sure what to say, because it's like Latour is right about a lot of things, but he's also weird and wrong about a lot of things too. So yes, he would become an intellectual giant. In 1978, he was nobody, and apparently they almost threw him out of the conference because he was such an ass. They said he's a little known philosopher, and they were icy to him. And yeah, there was even a move to evict him from the proceedings. Throw him out of the classroom, get him out of here. I didn't like this guy. So obviously he was a jerk back then, but he would go on to write. So perhaps his most famous book in some ways was an early book called We Have Never Been Modern, which was a critique of modernity. And then he also got famous for his ethnography, or one might call science studies. He was very famous in that, documenting how scientists do their work, but from an anthropological, sociological perspective. And then before he passed away, actually, when I saw him give a talk, he was much more interested in climate issues. And a lot of people are reading his work now on issues about climate and climate politics and being all in the same boat and watching out for the rich people trying to get off onto other planets and circle around in their yachts. He was very good about that. But in this time, Ingold is actually critiquing his book, or his idea of reassembling the social, which in part was based on this baboon research. Now, what Latour and Dr. Strum were claiming is that baboons didn't have any tools out there to use. They only have their own bodies, which Latour called soft tools. And so, because they only had their own bodies, their social relationships had to be shaped and reshaped all the time. Now, if in your world where you only have your own bodies, as Latour described it, nothing is fixed and everything to play for. And so your social life is exceedingly complex. That's why they had to have such big brains and think about everything. That's why you need those drones to track them, because they're all, you never know what they're going to do, right? So there you go. It's exceedingly complex, their life. Whereas, well, Simi, what do we have? What do we humans have that the baboons don't, at least according to Latour? Speech and symbolism, and be even more concrete than that. If they only have soft tools, what do we have? Yeah, we have durable tools, stuff that sticks around, and language and speech and symbols. And so Latour claimed that actually having this stuff to offload our lives into, unlike the baboons, would simplify social life. So you don't have to rethink everything every time you go out onto that baboon landscape. You don't have to have drones flying overhead, because I can just do a find my phone and see where you are, because I can call you up. Simply, it is a weird argument. And so the idea is that the more stuff you had, the more you could offload and write down or symbolize things, the more complex your society could be. It's a strange argument. And he came up with this diagram. This is from Latour himself, Strum and Latour, in fact. Yeah, it's odd. So here we have the baboons, right, who are maximum degree of social complexity, but minimum degree of being able to organize people to do things. Here we have hunter-gatherers who have less social complexity because they have language and things, but they don't have as many durable structures, so they also can't organize people as much. And then agriculture is here. And then we have industrial societies, which is us, where we are maximum ability to organize people, because if we don't do what we want, we just throw them in jail. We make sure they do what we want. If we give them a bad grade, that's like an external idea. It makes people do things, obviously. It always works for me. And so you have maximal social organization, but minimum social complexity, because we're all in our places. You don't have to worry about where you are every day, because you know who you are. You are students, I'm a professor, that's it. I'm a worker, you know where you are. It is an odd argument. There are several issues with this argument. Remember when we talked about the 19th century and the idea of superior and inferior societies and people and things? Well, as Ingold says here, it's very crucial. Latour, blah, blah, along with a theory of progress from the animal to the human and from the hunting and gathering of our earliest ancestors through agriculture, which could have come straight out of the 19th century. I guess a little bit, at least the baboons have credit for being super smart, whereas in the 19th century, Woody would have said we are both maximum smart and maximum complex. But still, this is a recapitulation of 19th century arguments about where human beings are going. There's another couple problems with this, which some of you realized, although you phrased them mostly as questions. To sum it up, one of the problems with the Latourian model is that it does not include non-human animals at all. It is all about stuff, basically, and the rise of stuff, and that animals in general play no part in this, and they can't play any part in this philosophical scheme. So that's one. Yeah, unless they're domesticated. Right, the domesticated animals. Yeah, because the domesticated animals are here, you see, or here, right? They do play a role.
They existed before.
Well, no, but not here. See, they're saying that they don't count here because we don't have domesticated animals, so they don't count. See, well, yeah, then they'd be more along this way. Remember, Ingold is critiquing this, and he says that's one of the problems. There's no room. One of the problems is it recapitulates 19th century ideas. Another problem is there's no room for anything except non-domestic or domesticated animals. And another problem, where do they live when we don't have to track them with drones? Do non-human animals ever go to different places? They migrate, but they migrate to familiar places, which form their social life. And they also in some ways use durable objects like tools, maybe not as much as humans do, but they're there. Yes, there's several problems with this. And again, Ingold is arguing against this model, but there are several issues with that. Now, one of the assumptions of this model is that social relationships are confined to members of their own species. That when we talk about a society, it is because humans are in a society. And if we want to talk about baboon society, it is because baboons relate to other baboons. Now, one of the questions is, why did they assume this? What does it go back to? Why would you assume that humans have their own species essence and can only talk and be in society with other humans? Who gave us that insane idea? Yeah, he probably was not the only one. But in these economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, which is when Marx, this is before he wrote the Communist Manifesto, he's just chilling out and trying to figure things out in his head, and he's writing all these things down. So the people who are cool with the ideas of Marx, they usually go back into this thing, because he's just writing some manuscripts and trying to figure this out. And it's basically proposing that humans do have this special form of consciousness, this species being, which enables them, I mean, not to get too far into Marx, but which enables us to talk to each other and then to do various forms of labor by which we transform nature. And that's when we would later get into later parts of Marx. But I was struck by the deer and the turkeys. Do they ever seem to be conscious of each other? Yeah.
They kind of, there's squirrels too, and they're all
Oh,
just like.
and they're all conscious, yeah,
Yeah.
and you're conscious of them and they get conscious of you. And so what Ingold is actually arguing for against Marx is that actually sociality can cross species boundaries, that we are social with other creatures, them with us and we with them. So he's arguing against this assumption that society only applies to human beings. He's also saying that it is not that there were fewer non-humans before in the past. So one of the arguments of the Latour argument, or one of the arguments of the Latour type people in that chart before, is that now we have more non-human things or non-humans to interact with, and we can fix our social relationships. And Ingold says, no, that's not true. But he does say something has happened in our transition. He says that now we have more of what he calls embodied code carriers. So these are things I would call this an embodied code carrier. It's something I can use to fix my relationships. I can use it to fix relationships and tear them apart really easy. But the thing is, it's like we can use all these objects and we can translate our human stuff onto them. So we have more of those, but we have fewer what he calls smart performers. Animals in our environment that do their own thing and we can't control them or tell them what to do. And in fact, where are we most likely to find a non-human animal in our life if we find one?
A dog?
They're most likely to find them as a domesticated animal, right? As our pet. And although our dogs might try to do things like bug you while you're doing your assignment, you also in some ways have, people put a lot of codes onto dogs. They dress them up, they control their lives and strength. So dogs in some ways almost become close to embodied code carriers. But the thing is, for the most part, I would say in our own country, or at least in my world, I don't have very many non-human smart performers in my life. Animals that do their own thing are not something I really interact with or care about on a daily basis. No, I don't.
I interact with Muggsy every day. It's your dog.
That's your dog. I don't have dogs or cats, though, so I don't have any animals to interact with. Birds and squirrels crawling all over people in London, for God's sakes. London. I do think that in the United States, we are particularly, except maybe in certain places of the United States, but at least in my world of the United States, yes, there are no birds and squirrels crawling all over me. And I don't even know if I would like that, but apparently the Londoners are fine with that. And I think that, yes, we have particularly separated ourselves from the smart performers. I had to tell you to go look at smart performers. If I didn't tell you, I don't know if anybody would have. Now, Ingold does like a couple people in anthropology, like Donna Haraway. When species meet, he cites approvingly, or actually he's citing approvingly her cross-species manifesto, or Eduardo Cohn's work, How Forests Think Toward an Anthropology Beyond the Human, which urged us to go beyond some of these human boundaries and that anthropology was more than simply studying humans and human sociality. And what he wants to get us to is an idea of studying with other humans and indeed other animals, other creatures. What Ingold is trying to tell us in his own strange way, the animals in their animaling have much to teach us so long as we allow them into our presence as the beings they are, and not as trying to put them into some other context. And the studying with is very important. He says the aim of studying with is to move forward in real time along with the multiple and heterogeneous beings with which we share our world in an active and ongoing exploration of the conditions and possibilities of our common life. And so the squirrels and their squirreling, which actually has become a word in English. When we squirrel things away, it's become a verb. But yes, the squirrels are out there doing their thing. And it is too bad that it is winter now, because I was hoping that we would see some of these wonderful groundhogs and be able to observe them running all over Hartwick campus. If there are any smart performers who are going to dig a hole under this whole campus, it's going to be the groundhogs. When we're all gone, they'll still be here living their lives.